In ancient times, when large cities were still being formed and people sought to understand the world around them, there lived a man named Abraham. He lived in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, where everything seemed comfortable and safe. The city was full of life, markets filled with goods, animals gathered in pastures, families caring for one another. Abraham was known for his honesty and kindness, walking among the people as someone they could trust. His wife was named Sarah, a woman of quiet beauty and steadfast heart, always by his side, sharing his joys and sorrows. While the people of Ur worshipped gods made by human hands, images of stone and wood, Abraham felt in his soul that there was something greater. On silent nights, under the starry sky, he would look up and wonder who had placed each star in its place. He felt that this world had a purpose, that there was a loving force behind everything the eyes could see. With each beat of his heart, Abraham felt a silent invitation that he did not yet fully understand. One day, when the birds were singing and the fields were green, a powerful yet gentle voice spoke to Abraham. It was not an ordinary sound, but a deep certainty, as if the words themselves were born within his chest. It said, "Abraham, leave your land, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name a blessing." These words echoed in such a way that Abraham could not ignore them. The invitation was clear before him. Leave everything he knew, the safe gates of the city, his parents' inheritance, and set out into the unknown. There were no maps, no guarantees. A curiosity was born in his heart, mixed with a natural fear of the new. How could he leave behind everything he had built? How would Sarah react? They had no children and were already advanced in age. What could this promise of a great nation mean? Even so, Abraham began to gather his belongings, talk to his servants, prepare the animals for a long journey, always with Sarah by his side. The people of Ur looked at them in amazement, some with admiration, others with suspicion, but Abraham was determined. Sarah, despite the fears she held in her heart, chose to trust Abraham, and together they endured days of intense heat and cold nights on unfamiliar ground, not knowing exactly where they would end up. Each step was driven by a silent faith, by a hope that seemed greater than any understanding. And so, under a starry sky, Abraham walked, becoming a pilgrim guided by a promise. The destination was still invisible, but the certainty of the divine voice was stronger than any doubt. And as the dust from the road rose behind Abraham and Sarah, one question remained. How would that promise, so grand, be fulfilled in their lives, especially when everything seemed impossible? This journey of faith was just beginning. Days and nights passed as Abraham, Sarah, and their group advanced toward the unknown. The wind carried different scents, and the look in each of their eyes betrayed a mixture of weariness and hope. The landscape changed before them. Hills, fields golden in the sun, silent valleys, and lands never before trodden by their feet. During the journey, at each stop, Abraham set up an altar and prayed, giving thanks for protection and asking for guidance. Faith, so often invisible, seemed like a force that sustained his steps even in the most uncertain moments. At times, fear lurked. Sarah looked around, realizing that her comfortable life had been left behind and that the future was uncertain. The silence weighed heavily on the cold nights, but it was also in this solitude that hope was renewed. Abraham, even without fully understanding God's plans, cultivated in his heart the certainty that he was not alone. He remembered the words of the promise, thinking about how something so impossible could happen to two elderly people who had never had children. But amid his doubts, he remembered, to obey is to trust, and that was all he embraced. Upon arriving in the land of Canaan, Abraham looked around, feeling the new wind and the different trees. It was a beautiful place, but it was also inhabited by other peoples, full of their traditions, fears, and beliefs. The Canaanites, with their altars and strange gods, looked strangely at this group of strangers who pitched tents and prayed to an invisible God. Still, Abraham was not intimidated. He continued to build small altars, firm in his commitment to the promise he had received. Time passed, and famine came to that land. Food began to run out, placing Abraham and his family before a new trial. Anguish and despair surrounded the camp, but Abraham decided to go down to Egypt, where there was still plenty. The journey reinforced the weight of his choices and the need to protect his family. Before the Egyptians, Abraham's heart was heavy with fear, but he sought to protect Sarah, knowing that she was still admired for her beauty, even in her old age. Amid uncertainty, flight, and new beginnings, a new awareness was forming in the hearts of Abraham and Sarah. They were learning that true faith is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Abraham looked up at the sky, the stars shining above him like distant promises, and felt that even with all the difficulties, it was there, walking toward the voice he heard, that the story of his life was truly beginning. And even though he did not know everything he would face, he believed that God had not forgotten him. In their hearts, the promise was alive, waiting to be fulfilled. The journey through Egypt left deep marks on the souls of Abraham and Sarah. They returned to Canaan with more riches, but also with memories of fear and risk, realizing how, in the absence of easy answers, their trust in God was put to the test. The camp was re-erected in the fields of Canaan, and with it, the hope that better times would come. Abraham spent long moments in silence, away from the tents, gazing at the orange horizon of the sunset. Sarah, even though she tried to keep herself busy with daily tasks, noticed the weight in her husband's eyes. Difficulties soon arose again. The land was disputed, and Abraham's shepherds soon came into conflict with the shepherds of Lot, his nephew. Arguments multiplied, animals collided in the narrow fields, and tension grew among family members. Abraham, seeking peace and discernment, called Lot and offered him a choice. Each should go his own way to avoid discord. With a generous heart, Abraham gave his nephew the right to choose first. Lot looked up and saw the fertile Jordan Valley, resembling the gardens of Egypt, and chose those lands for himself. Abraham, without hesitation, went to the less obvious regions, trusting that God would take care of everything. At that moment, alone in the silent fields, Abraham heard the same voice again. God renewed his promise, saying that all that land would be given to him and his descendants, as numerous as the dust of the earth. At that moment, the weight of loneliness turned into hope. Still, there was always an emptiness that stubbornly hurt, the absence of a child. Sarah also felt time slipping through her fingers. She saw the women around her having children and experienced a silent sadness, a feeling that the impossible would never happen for her. The silence between them was not one of lovelessness, but of unanswered questions, of promises that seemed increasingly distant. Sometimes Sarah cried at nightfall, keeping her desire to be a mother to herself. Abraham, sensing Sarah's feelings, tried to comfort her with gestures of affection and words of faith, even though his own heart sometimes wavered. But amid the sadness and uncertainty, a stronger feeling was forming: perseverance. Even without knowing the future, Abraham and Sarah remained faithful to what they had heard. They learned to lay their pain before God, turning every tear into prayer. The heavens seemed to respond in silence. But Abraham increasingly surrendered himself to the promise and nurtured the hope that, in time, everything would change. A feeling of expectation grew, as if at any moment something extraordinary could happen, forever changing the course of their lives. One night, the sky seemed deeper and quieter than ever. Abraham lingered outside his tent, restless, feeling the weight of many years and promises still pending. The wind whispered through the bushes, and the twinkling stars hinted at unfathomable mysteries. Lying on the cold ground, Abraham began to count the stars, an almost childish attempt to fill his loneliness and the absence of that promised offspring. His eyes burned, not only from the cold of the early morning, but also from the doubts he was trying to stifle. It was difficult to ignore the passage of time, to see Sarah's body weaken and to hear, night after night, the repeated echo of the promises. As hope mingled with weariness, Abraham heard God's guidance again, telling him not to fear, for he would be his protection and reward. Overcome by a timid boldness, he confessed his sadness. How blessed would he be if he had no heir? From the midst of the silence, the answer was clear. It would not be a servant who would inherit his blessings, but a son born of himself. And as he was led outside, he felt the vastness of the sky envelop him. The stars were countless, like the promise that now shone brighter than ever. Abraham knelt, his knees dug into the ground, tears mixing with the dust, and there he renewed his faith, recognizing that waiting was part of his calling. Back in the tent, Sarah heard her husband's cries and felt a mixture of compassion and despair in her soul. She saw the years stealing her youth, her womb proving infertile, and her dream of motherhood turning into almost unbearable pain. The next day, in the light of a timid morning, Sarah, consumed by her own anguish, made a difficult decision. She spoke to Abraham, suggesting that he have a child with Hagar, his Egyptian servant. The proposal sounded strange, but, overcome by the eagerness to see the promise fulfilled, they accepted the arrangement, hoping that what they had been waiting for would come to pass. Time passed quickly. Hagar became pregnant, and hope resurfaced in the camp, but it also brought with it envy, resentment, and discomfort. Sarah, once determined, now felt the weight of jealousy, and Hagar, pregnant, began to feel superior in her condition. The atmosphere became tense, conversations became dry, and Abraham found himself torn, struggling to appease a troubled home. What seemed like a solution became a new test. The nights grew longer, voices fell silent around the fire. Each person closed off in their own anguish. Abraham now realized that maturing in faith was not just waiting, but learning to deal with the consequences of choices. Even in the face of this new obstacle, he did not allow the light of promise to be extinguished. The pain was deeper, but so was the certainty that God was still present, silent, weaving the invisible path of hope. The heat of the day was intense when Hagar, troubled by Sarah's hostility, fled silently into the desert, taking with her the life growing in her womb. Abraham only found out when Hagar was already far away, and despair took hold of the camp. Sarah, consumed by remorse and insecurity, hid her face in her hands, feeling the weight of her rash decisions. The silence was broken only by the dry wind and the distressed whispers of the servants. Abraham, tormented by guilt, prayed in secret, invoking God's presence to bring peace where there was only conflict. As Hagar walked aimlessly, thirsty and exhausted, an invisible presence made itself felt at her side, bringing relief to her tears. A soft, powerful voice called her by name and asked her where she was coming from and where she was going. In the presence of this being, Hagar revealed her distress and fear, expecting only death in the desert. But the voice commanded her to return and submit to Sarah, promising that the boy in her womb would also give rise to a great nation. There, in the midst of the piercing silence of the desert, Hagar recognized that she was being seen by the God who sees everything, and her soul was filled with courage and hope. She returned to the camp transformed, her eyes reflecting the promise and her feet bearing the weight of humility. The birth of Ishmael changed the rhythm of life around the tents. Abraham proudly watched the boy grow up healthy, but emptiness still lingered in some corner of Sarah's heart. The child's laughter was a reminder of her own limitations and the distance from her intimate fulfillment. However, after days of rebellion and hurt, Sarah experienced a silent maturing. She realized that beyond the disappointments and bitterness of jealousy, a lesson was emerging. God kept his promises, but not in the human way, and divine timing was impossible to rush. Abraham also changed. The weight of his mistakes made him more sensitive to the suffering of others, and the love he felt for Sarah became less anxious and more compassionate. His prayers, once marked by hasty requests, gave way to deep silences, where his heart opened to listening rather than just speaking. One afternoon, under a tree, Abraham watched Ishmael play, and Sarah, now less bitter, waved to her husband with a shy smile. It was as if a new page was being turned. Their shared suffering, shared hope, and quiet miracles began to transform each of them at their core, preparing them for the impossible that was yet to come, when all that remained was to trust completely. In the heat of the evening, Abraham rested at the entrance to his tent, gazing at the distant horizon, lost in thought and memories. The camp went about its peaceful routine, the sound of herds in the distance, Ishmael running under Hagar's watchful gaze, while Sarah rested seated in the shade, her gaze lost in the sky. Suddenly, 3 men approached along the dusty road, imposing figures of distinguished appearance. Abraham sensed something different and, moved by an irresistible impulse, ran to greet them, prostrating himself before them in reverence. With humility, he invited them to rest, offering them water to wash their feet, cool shade, and a simple feast quickly prepared by Sarah and the servants. As they ate in the shade of the oak tree, one of them asked for Sarah. Abraham, surprised, replied that she was in the tent. The long-forgotten promise was then recalled with simple but powerful words. The following year, Sarah would have a son. Not far away, behind the linen curtain, Sarah heard and could not contain a bitter laugh, disbelieving that she could know such joy after so much time and weariness, her own body marked by the years. Still, the voice affirmed that nothing was impossible for God. Sarah's laughter, mixed with pain, hope, and disbelief, revealed the conflict between divine promises and human limitations. The visitors left, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with mystery and expectation. In the days that followed, Abraham was overcome by a different kind of peace, a silent conviction that the impossible could happen. He looked at Sarah with renewed tenderness, seeing in her not the tired woman, but the heiress of the promise. Sarah, in turn, experienced an internal transformation. Doubt gave way to hope, still timid, but present. She ran her hands over her empty womb without the same bitterness, daring to dream again. When night came and all was quiet, they both felt something new growing inside them. Faith not only in God's words, but in the invisible presence that sustained every breath and every step in that desert of expectations. Abraham and Sarah, now united in hope, quietly prepared for what time and the world itself deemed impossible. The days in Canaan seemed the same at first glance, but there was an expectation submerged in each of their hearts. Abraham walked through the fields at dusk, carrying with him all he had learned in the years of waiting, failures, new beginnings, and promises whispered in the silent nights. Ishmael ran among the servants, growing strong and fearless, but there was a restless tenderness in Abraham's gaze whenever he looked at his son, gratitude for the life he had received, but a certain longing for something still incomplete. At home, Sarah devoted herself to her daily tasks with a new kind of hope, quieter than before, less cheerful, but deeper. Every gesture of her husband, every word exchanged between them, seemed laden with meaning, as if they both knew they were on the verge of something irreversible. One night, while everyone was asleep, Abraham left the tent and stared at the star-studded sky. Hot tears burned his face as he remembered God's words, the promise of that impossible son, the doubts that had invaded him so many times, Sarah's silent tears, and the choices made out of fear and haste. He was now a man transformed by waiting and suffering, and he realized that doubts were instruments of learning. That pain had made him human and compassionate. For the first time, he felt that his path was not just about conquering lands or producing offspring, but about learning total trust in the one who had called him. And you are. There, under a sky that seemed vaster than ever, Abraham understood the true meaning of the promise. It was not just about the son, but about becoming someone capable of trusting completely, even when everything seemed impossible. A few days later, Sarah, now free from the burden of disbelief, began to feel the signs of new life within her. A mixture of amazement and joy overwhelmed her. Abraham, noticing the transformation in his wife, saw in her the living fulfillment of the hope that had so often been threatened. Soon, the news that Sarah was expecting a child spread throughout the camp, creating an atmosphere of amazement and celebration. Her laughter was now pure and genuine, unlike the bitter smile of the past. Joy spread and touched everyone around her, washing away old pains, bringing light to the desert and warmth to hearts hardened by waiting. Joy flooded every glance, every corner of the tent. Abraham and Sarah, now united in faith and compassion, understood the purpose of their journey. More than inheriting land or riches, they needed to learn to trust, to transform pain into love and doubt into serene confidence. It was there, between the sky and the desert, that the impossible finally became reality, and the old laughter of bitterness gave way to the unbridled joy of those who understand that, in His time, God fulfills His promises. Time passed, and with it, changes became visible not only in the camp, but in everyone's hearts. Sarah's womb, which for so many years had been a source of tears and questions, was now growing full of life, causing admiration and joy among servants, relatives, and shepherds. Sarah's laughter echoed contagiously, resounding across the fields and bringing hope to women and men weary of living with the impossible. Abraham, once marked by anxiety and silent longing, now walked through the camp with confident steps, a certain serenity stamped on his face. With every glance exchanged between him and Sarah, there was renewed complicity, a recognition of the arduous path they had traveled together, of the pain that had matured, of the love deepened by time and tears. The flocks prospered, the tent was filled with new sounds and lives, and Ishmael, once an only child, was preparing to be a brother. Hagar had also changed since the initial turmoil, learning to live with Sarah, no longer driven by rivalry, but by a silent acceptance of the greater designs and value of each individual journey. Faith, once fragile and tenuous, now became the driving force of the camp. Altars were erected, and prayers were filled with gratitude rather than requests. At night, Abraham would look up at the stars and smile, no longer wishing for immediate answers, but giving thanks for the lessons in patience and trust, understanding that God's promises are not limited to gifts or victories, but are also fulfilled in the transformation of those who believe. Abraham's relationship with God had become intimate, deep, and serene. He knew that it was not the absence of difficulties that showed divine favor, but the ability to go through them strengthened, always sustained by hope. Sarah, with the growth of new life in her womb, saw herself healed from the bitterness of the past. The laughter that had once been incredulous now announced healing, celebration, and the renewal of dreams. Around the fire, she told of the days of tears and of God's faithfulness, and the younger women listened, learning from her story the value of waiting and trusting. The entire camp was transformed. Men and women encouraged one another, knowing that each had their own promise, their own desert, and that victory was not just the fulfillment of a desire, but the fellowship and renewed faith that arose along the way. Abraham and Sarah finally lived no longer in the shadow of waiting, but in the light of fulfillment, certain that together they were part of something infinitely greater than they could comprehend. Dawn came silently that morning, pouring a golden glow over Abraham's tents. The soft singing of birds mingled with the murmur of expectation that hung in the air. Inside the largest tent, time seemed suspended. Sarah, surrounded by caring hands and attentive eyes, was in the throes of childbirth. Abraham, outside, paced anxiously, feeling every pulse of the earth beneath his feet, as if all creation were waiting with him. The servants looked at each other, aware that they were witnesses to the day when the promise would become life. Suddenly, a loud, clear cry broke the silence of the camp. It was as if the wind had changed direction, bringing with it new breath and hope. Sarah, exhausted and overwhelmed, took her long-awaited son into her arms, feeling a deep peace fill her whole being. She who had carried the burden of absence for so long now felt her heart overflowing. Abraham entered the tent, his hands trembling, his eyes moist. He saw Sarah with the newborn in her arms and, before this scene, knelt in reverence, realizing the miracle before him. Tears ran freely down his wrinkled face, gratitude flooding his chest. The boy was named Isaac, meaning laughter, for Sarah's smile became contagious, echoing among everyone in the camp. Men, women, even the oldest and most weary felt their faith and joy reborn as they gazed upon the child. The altars were filled with praise, meals turned into feasts, and the words whispered at night carried renewed hope. Sarah, feeling little Isaac in her arms, remembered the days of doubt, the years of almost unbearable waiting, and realized that every tear had been watered with promise. Abraham, kissing his son's forehead, understood that God's faithfulness surpassed human understanding. It was not about waiting, but about trusting, surrendering, allowing faith to be forged by the fire of trials. Now, surrounded by the warmth of his family, the patriarch looked to the future with absolute certainty that where there is promise, there is fulfillment, and that the joy born there was only the beginning of an eternal legacy, sealed by the miracle of life. Time passed, and Abraham's camp, once filled with faltering voices and hopeful glances, now vibrated with an atmosphere of gratitude and purpose. Isaac grew strong, running among the tents, his laughter echoing among the people and reminding them all of God's faithfulness. Sarah, now elderly, saw in her son confirmation that neither time nor human limitations are obstacles to the one who promises. The days of bitterness and loneliness became a distant memory, replaced by conversations about miracles and perseverance around the fire at night. Abraham walked through the fields with Isaac, teaching him about each star in the sky, about the long journeys, the deserts they had crossed, and the days of doubt. He told him, with a firm voice and a bright gaze, that the true inheritance was not just land or riches, but faith and trust in the God who is able to make possible what seems inconceivable. The people looked at Abraham with respect, recognizing in him not only a patriarch, but an example of devotion, humility, and daily hope. The tents were fuller, and with each new visitor who heard the story of the miracle, the camp became a refuge for those who were still waiting for their own promises. Hagar and Ishmael were also welcomed, and now entire families gathered to pray, knowing that Abraham's journey was an invitation for every person, at any time, to learn to trust even when the answer is delayed or the outlook is bleak. In the maturity of his life, Abraham fully understood that his greatest legacy was not his possessions, but the example he left behind, a story marked by faith and the courage to remain obedient even in the face of uncertainty. Life revealed to him that trust requires sacrifice, that the greatest victories are those that take place within the heart, and that every step taken by faith brings man closer to a greater purpose. Sarah, with white hair and a youthful smile, shared her journey with the younger women, teaching them that waiting for a promise builds character and shapes destiny. The sunset bathed the camp in golden light as everyone gathered to give thanks together. There, in that land that had once been foreign, a family, a people, and a lesson had emerged. No promise is too late. No dream is impossible for God. Abraham's story became a symbol of hope for all time, inspiring those who doubt to continue, those who cry to wait, and those who believe to celebrate. And so, Abraham's legacy lived on beyond the deserts, guiding lives and hearts for generations. If you were moved and inspired by this story, don't forget to like it, comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to follow many other stories full of faith and hope.